Thanks, Tim. Appreciate you having us on. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. I'm going to buckle up and learn a little bit about design analytics. To get us started, I thought it would be nice if you guys could share with me kind of what learning analytics you currently use. So all of us have analytics in our companies that we use for showing our value or just really for running our business. So could you pop in your chat which learning analytics you typically use, where they come from? LMS platform. Very good. A lot of people get them from their LMS platform. Anybody else have anything else out there? Okay, SurveyMonkey. Great, great. Well, that hits surveys. Perfect. Okay, so let's talk about those a little bit. So when we get an LMS, we get our number of courses that we've done, number of students that sign up for our courses. We may or may not have completions, like how many completions we've had. We've got a lot of good information on basically the activities of the learning department, right? And then when we get surveys from our stakeholders, we send them out to our students, which you guys are going to complete a little bit later, and say, did we like the program? Did we think we use the program? Is it valuable to us? So we have a lot of different mechanisms. Some people also, particularly for their e-learning, they'll go and use like tracking tools where they go in and they say these people moved here or moved there or completed this section. So we call those activity analytics. But with all of these different analytics that we have, how many of you feel like those analytics that we are providing to our, business unit leaders or actually to our senior leaders in our organization are giving us the value or the impact that we actually do? Do you feel like your analytics are providing an understanding of the value of your work? All these big no's out there. Okay, I'm right there with you. So this will really help you today because essentially our whole industry is devoid of having a means to really show our value. Design analytics have proven to be a very good way of doing that. So let's move on. So everything that I'm going to talk to you today is kind of written in the book ROI by Design. If you guys want to look that up at some point, I'm going to share with you a methodology because we're going to talk about what are design analytics, how they're created first, then how they're captured, and then what they actually tell us. Many times people talk about they want a seat at the table, right? And we need a seat at the table. We have a very big impact on our organizations. So if they don't give us a seat at the table, we kind of take the philosophy to bring your own chair. And so today I'm going to provide you information on design analytics, which really is a very comfortable seat. So this screen shows you kind of our methodology here at eParamus. And when you have design analytics, the whole goal is for design analytics to provide you information to evolve yourself in those conversations. So that's why it's a really comfortable seat. So let's talk about what design analytics are. Design analytics, they are created, derived from the objectives which declare the intended job outcomes. So if you think about all of your courses, the LMS will tell you which courses you have, the number of the subjects, right? Or maybe even the topics. But really, if you want to know what you're getting out of a learning program, you have to look at the objectives to get that. So the objectives are what we use to really declare the intended job outcomes. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. But that's one of the main components of what makes up data analytics. Design analytics are made viable by targeting job outcomes. So if we were just tracking objectives, it would be meaning that we just are targeting the subjects that are in our particular courses. Design analytics shift that a little bit, and instead of just targeting the objectives, it makes those objectives into job targets. And when we make those job targets, then we connect all the other learning design components towards hitting that target. So you're beginning to get a picture in your mind, hopefully, of looking at the design of the course, looking at the objectives being, instead of they will know blank, it is really what they will be doing. And then all of our design components connect to that. So when you do that, that creates kind of this standard design. And that standard design, because it's standardized and all those components are connected, it allows you to assess the effectiveness on reaching those goals and the decisions that you make in order to reach those goals. So that's what design analytics are. They're derived from the objectives. Those objectives are made by being job targets. And then all of your design components towards that creates a standardization. So let's first talk about getting to ROI. And that's important for us to kind of really understand where we make impact in an organization. So we always start out at kind of this examining state. That's when they come to us and they say, hey, I need a course on ABC, or somebody says this metric has got a problem. I want to fix this metric, so I want you to give me a course on blank. That's when we do the examining. Everybody's familiar with that. We like to do an analysis. Many times they don't let us do an analysis, but we do our best. We examine the state. We come up with where we want to go. So the examining phase, that's where we begin. Then after we go and we start to design a course, we go into creating that course and we teach that course. And that's where we make changes to the employees. Once we change by giving them the knowledge or the skills, then they go to apply that. So it's not enough just for them to learn it. They actually have to be able to apply it on the job if we want to see changes in the organization. Unfortunately, in our world, what happens is we go in, we create this great learning course. They get here, and for some reason, they don't get it applied to the job. Most of the reasons are out of our span of control. And then when they come back and these people complain and they say learning wasn't good. So it's necessary for us to be able to track learning as it goes from the examining phase through the learning, the applying, and the impact phase. Once they apply it on the job, then we should be able to see metrics change as they go. So each phase is kind of a link in the chain that builds that capability within an organization. We really do need to track it as it goes all the way through that if we're going to give a compelling argument as to what is happening. Let's talk about our learning objectives. Now, many times when I first talk to people, they say, oh yeah, my learning objectives, I'll tell you what you're going to get out of this course. And then when I look at the learning objectives, sometimes they're written like goals, like these broad statements. Sometimes they're actually written very minute. You're going to learn how to do ABC. But really, when you write an objective like that, they typically describe the material that's being covered. They look at the material, they say, here's an objective for this piece of material, that piece of material. The hardest part of everything that we do, and we do a tremendous amount in our organization, but the hardest part that we do is to get designers to describe what the learner will know and do on the job in those outcomes. And I'm going to pause here for a second and just let us think about that. So anybody goes into a learning course and you've got objectives and they tell us what we're going to learn, that's great. That gives us some idea, okay, this is why I'm coming to this class. But when we describe what the learner is going to be doing and those descriptions fit the job, think of the difference that creates in that student, that employee. Now they're looking at it and say, okay, this is the requirements for my job and this is what it's going to help me do my job better. So when you focus those objectives to outcomes and make that application to the job and from the perspective of the employee, the learning becomes much more direct to their job and they become much more embedded into that learning so that you have a clear target of whether it's reached. If you have just, do I know the material, then I can have a test question that says, do you know the 5 stages of the ADDIE model? And I could tell you those 5 stages of the ADDIE model. Great. But whether I know those 5 stages of the ADDIE model, how does that have anything to do with my job? What really knows is, can I apply those 5 stages of the ADDIE model when I'm creating a course? That's the important part. At the very basis of design analytics, you need to be able to convert your objectives into outcome objectives. In the past, if you look at our literature over the years, there's a tremendous amount about performance objectives called very different things, but they all had the right idea. If we create our objectives as outcomes, those are going to be the things that actually make an impact to the organization. So when we think about outcomes, we have learned over the years, we've been doing this a lot of years, that there are really 3 different outcomes that you can get from when you think about a business outcome. And if you guys have ever run a department, this will be very, very resonate with you. If you run a department, you're watching your employees and working with your employees, and you're looking for a few things. You're either looking to be able to observe them doing something different. That's a physical skill, physically doing something different. Or you're looking to see that they have critical thinking skills. They're decision-making or problem-solving. They're able to do that. These are the 2 categories of skills that everyone uses in their jobs, right? Whether it's soft skills, hard skills, whatever you want to call it, they're always going to be manifest into either a behavior skill or a critical thinking skill. Now, in order for us to have one of these kind of skills, we often have to have basic knowledge. So when you're designing a learning program, you're putting basic knowledge into that learning program, but its only goal is to be able to get you to one of these 2 areas. So in design analytics, we will take the content that you're covering, we will categorize it into outcomes, business outcomes that fit one of these categories: a behavior, a physical skill, critical thinking skill, or it's going to be a basic knowledge. So essentially, learning objectives are all categorized into these performance outcomes. Can you guys think of anything, any course that you've ever taught that you couldn't take one of those objectives and categorize it into one of these three categories? No. Okay. We've done this a long time and we've never been able to, because if you think about when you look at job skills and job requirements, it's always going to come down to these capabilities. So let's talk about if you've got a course where you're teaching feeling or awareness. When you are teaching feeling or awareness, that's going to manifest somehow, right? For instance, if I am going to be decision making and you're trying to give me an awareness of diversity, you would want to see diversity be reflected in my decision making. So regardless of attitude, because we can only impact a knowledge, skill, or an attitude. If it's an attitude, every attitude that we are trying to convey in a program is going to manifest. We want it to manifest in the way I do my job. So our role as a designer is to convert the content that I'm teaching them into using it in the job. That's why you could put it into one of these things, right? So if you're teaching me some feeling, I'm going to be using that feeling either in my problem-solving decision-making or when I physically do something. Okay, so I think we can move on here. So what we know now, what we've learned is when we're creating design analytics, we are really measuring the objectives. The objectives are put into one of these business outcomes. And one of the biggest concerns I hear from a lot of people is they feel like the learning department is kind of divorced from the rest of the organization, right? They don't seem to understand what we do. A lot of times that is centered around the words that we use, right? If you are able to categorize your objectives into one of these things, you are talking the language of every business unit who's asking you to do a course. So they're all going to be talking to you about their expectations of what they see from their employees, and their expectations are going to be measured against what physically they're able to see or what critical thinking skills they're actually seeing their employees do. So if you start by categorizing it like this, you immediately remove some of those barriers of the disconnect between what learning is doing and what business is doing. And my dissertation focus was on the disconnect between learning professionals and business professionals. And this is one of the big things that came up, is that business professionals don't want to hear about learning objectives. They want to hear about critical thinking skills and they want to hear about behavior. So if you can, at the very least, design your programs so that you have outcomes, you categorize your outcomes this way, you've really improved your ability to connect with other business units. So let's move on to the rest of the design of the course. So what we did was we kind of stepped back and we said, originally when we started, we're all about measurement. We went in and tried to measure programs to find out, what the deal was, whether they made any impact or not. And what we learned really early on was all we could measure was whether people liked it or otherwise, because we had no other unit of measure. So that's when we realized the design of the program is vital for us to be able to measure against the intended outcomes. We couldn't say they're going to have good communication skills or whatever, because there was no way to quantify that. So we focus on designing this way. We call this measurable instructional design. I'm only going to briefly do it here because we only have an hour, but enough for you to be able to grab a hold of it yourselves. So measurable instructional design basically has these 5 steps, and I'll explain each one of them for you. The first thing we ask people to do is, in that first conversation with people, is identify the key performance metric. Now, there are certain ways to identify this key performance metric, and this can go back to some people's thoughts about Phillips ROI. The challenge with doing it, if you're familiar with Phillips, is you can't just pick any metric and say, I'm going to take all the cost from training and then I'm going to pick a metric and then I'm going to run the calculation. Now, the calculation is a normal calculation. Everybody runs the same type of calculation. The reason is that doesn't show what training actually made a difference in that metric, right? So we teach people to pick the key performance metric that can be impacted by training. And I don't know if it's in this slide deck, but I'll tell you right now, that is always going to be a business unit metric. It's not going to be employee satisfaction or customer satisfaction or any of those things, because those are really several layers away from where we actually make an impact. When we are doing learning, we are changing job performance, right? So job performance, whatever is measuring those job performance are going to be our metric. And it makes a difference, right? If we choose a metric that is a productivity metric versus a quality metric, we might put very different content into our course, right? If it's a productivity metric, I'm going to be working on doing it faster, more efficiently, right? If it's a quality metric, I'm going to be asking you to do it with more rigor or with using particular methods, right? So picking that metric makes a difference if the designer starts with that metric in mind, because we're going to test against that metric and make sure that you're addressing the metric that they are asking for. The second piece is the job standards. So let's say I go in, I'm going to use an example of have salespeople increase leads. So if I want to have salespeople increase leads, I've got a metric that measures how many leads that we have available to us, or salespeople have available to them. My job standards are, okay, what are the ways that we are supposed to make leads here? How am I supposed to get those leads, right? What do I tell them to do in my job standards? This is going to be your SOPs, your WPs, anything in your organization that says this is the right way, the company way of doing whatever this skill is. In this case, we're doing leads, right? We're generating leads. So in our first conversations, or when we're doing our examining phase, we're asking, what is the KPM we're looking for? What's the metric in the organization that we're trying to change? Okay, we're going to do that by getting them to be able to create more leads. And what are the standards in which we need to use to do that? So this is all of our analysis. These two things together create our learning goal. Does that summary resonate with everybody from your courses that you've had with people or conversations? Okay. Good. Yes, sometimes the manager or someone was saying that sometimes the manager or the requester doesn't know, which is right. Sometimes they don't know, but that shouldn't stop us from saying, hey, let's make an agreement as to what we're trying to hit here. And if they don't know, then we need to ask them about their business, which is one of the things that some of the leaders said in that dissertation I referred to, is that they don't feel like training people really know their business. But when we start talking about their business, and even if we start using the indicators that they have in their head, that immediately aligns us. So it might take a few conversations for you to do it, but there are ways to do it. And I see it all the time, a shift. Because the whole idea is for them to shift their understanding of who we are and for us to become a partner with them. And that's one of the ways to do it. So if they don't know it, we have conversations to try to figure it out, right? And then we document it. And then we go and say, okay, here's the KPM, here's the job standards, this is my analysis, this is my target. Then in our design model, what we do is we take those job standards that we've identified and we translate those into learning objectives. So these learning objectives are really pulled out from our job standards. When we do those learning objectives, we add the conditions of the job and the criteria of their performance, the criteria we would have gotten from here, right? What specific ways are we supposed to do it? Many of you, if you look at the science of our industry, if you look at Mager design, Mager objectives, that's a great way for you to follow this. So we put our conditions of the job and the criteria of the job. That does two things. It focuses the designer on making sure that the training is focused on the job, and it helps clarify for the student that it connects to the job. So this is vital. It's vital that we use those pieces so that we make that objective real to the job. When we have created an objective that is fit for the job and we know what level we need to do it in, then we have already decided what way we're going to evaluate it, because the criteria that we use over here is going to be used here, right? If I need to be able to do leads by using Boolean searches, which is internet searches, newspaper ads, whatever that is, those three things, that's the level that I need you to be doing those searches in. That's going to be what I'm going to assess. So there's a direct connection between the criteria, condition and criteria, the objective to the assessment. So you can think of the objective as this is where I'm going. This is the job. This is where I'm going on the job. The assessment of this is how I know that I got there. And then once I know where I'm headed and how I can verify that I got there, then and only then would I decide what my instructional methods are. I'll pause here for a second and tell you that oftentimes when I am talking to people and I ask them about their learning programs, the first thing they do is they start telling me about the instructional method. They're going to do it via e-learning. They're going to do this exercise, or they're going to do whatever. They start here and they start visualizing in their head how they're going to put it in Articulate, or how they're going to, exercise they're going to do or whatever. That is backward. And it's part of the problem is they're only thinking about the content, and they're thinking about how do I make this content pretty? Well, that's one of the things that got us into a lot of trouble, right? This instructional method should only be informed by knowing this very tight target, this assessment. What you're looking at here is, this is what we call the three-legged stool. I'm going to explain this a little bit more in a minute. But what this essentially is saying is these three things right here, when you put them together, this is our measurable unit. This is what we're measuring. We're measuring the interaction between these three things. These three things combined make the goal. So this section here is actually that part of the design that achieves the goal. So I'm going to show you this slide, how it's created and what makes that design analytics valid. This is just a blow up of what I've got right here. This is showing you that stool. So these three pieces, the last part of the design. This is the performance, the condition, and criteria. And so those of you can see this on the slides, since I know Tim has them available for you. It is saying that the performance that you're looking for, the conditions that you're looking for, and then the criteria, each one of those informs on the instruction and the evaluation. So we're actually measuring basic knowledge, critical thinking skills, and observable behaviors. Those are all different types of objectives. The interaction between these three things make that happen. I'll give you a brief example. If I were to have an objective that was, let's say, a critical thinking objective, how to find a lead, and I want you to find a lead through Boolean searches, web-based, or whatever. If I use that, and my objective says that I'm going to find leads with those three methods, and I evaluate it with a true-false question of there are different ways to find leads, then my outcome is going to be very different than if I actually evaluate it with you telling me how to find them through Boolean searches, how to find them through web searches, etc. So you see what I'm saying? If you, as the designer, connect the condition and criteria directly to the evaluation and to the instruction, that creates a valid and reliable measurement of your design program. It allows you to be able to go back and diagnose and repair the decisions that you made. If my evaluation, everybody gets it right, but they can't do it on the job, then I know I have to change my evaluation. This is kind of the key piece of how design analytics is created. And actually what it's doing is it's asking us as a profession to use the science of our work and actually design with this credible design method. None of this that you're looking at here is new. It's all in our best practices. It's kind of like the Six Sigma for design. But if we follow our own best practices, that gives us ammunition. So then what ends up happening, if you design this way, where you're targeting the KPM and the standards, you're using these things and connecting all three of these things together, then you're creating that solid design with these outcomes, these are the outcomes we're measuring. Then you have one assessment. This assessment, you've got assessment for every objective you have. Then you have one assessment that can verify everything from what I knew when I started to whether or not I did it on the job. So I'll pause for a second, let you think about that. Right now, when we do our learning programs, we might have an assessment. You know, a lot of people have assessments, but many, many times those assessments are not directly related to the rigor or to the actual objectives. In this design, you can say, if you have this skill, behavior skill, or this critical thinking skill, I can measure whether or not you have that skill. Think of how powerful that is, which is what learning should be doing all the time. All of our courses, we should be able to have a benchmark for success of whatever skill we say that we are providing them. Let's talk specifically about what this assessment looks like, and then we're going to move in how they're captured, which will answer about on the job for you. So right now, just as long as we leave this slide understanding that these are basically the skills that we have, and these are our evaluations for those skills. So if I know how to particular lead, I have an assessment that says I know how to do that. So anytime in the organization, I should be able to take that assessment to find out if anybody in the organization has that skill, as long as we walk away with that understanding. So when we look at measuring those three outcomes, we're looking at behavior skills. We're always going to need those for observation. This is used a lot in healthcare. I know we're in pharma now, but it's used a lot in healthcare, sometimes in leadership training. And this is one of those things where you're going to have a checklist where you're going to say they do this. It's also used a lot in sales. Sometimes when salespeople go through a sales program, they've got a sales leader that's watching them and helping them go through those. Critical thinking skills, those can be measured through written scenarios. Those critical thinking skills, decision making and problem solving, 95% of what we want them to come out with in our courses. Once you start categorizing, you'll start to see that We want people to be able to problem solve and decision making and be able to make good decisions. And most of the time when we are teaching them about their jobs, that's where it is. In those cases, we can give them scenario-based questions, which will enable them to have to show that critical thinking skill. And then basic knowledge are also by written test. So at the bottom here, it says providing employees their skill progression enables them to actively participate in their own professional development. This was put in here because it brings up a huge point that we've learned over the years. First when we started this, they said, employees are not going to want to take assessments to know how they've done, and they're not going to want to deal with that. And this is what we have learned. First of all, everybody who's on the class right now has a degree of some kind, right? We have some kind of degree. When we went and finished that degree and we started like on our first job, how did we have the confidence that we could actually do the job that we were trained for? We gained that confidence because we passed all their tests, right? When we send a survey to our employees when they've taken a course from us, essentially we are saying to them, I don't know how to measure whether or not you learned, and so you need to tell me whether or not it was valuable, which is not the way for us to get credibility, that seat at the table, right? When we go in and we say, we don't know what impact we are having, so we need to ask everybody else to give us our impact. That is a really piss poor way, and probably only organization and company that does it that way. Hey, tell me if I'm doing my job. When you provide employees where they're actually, you got this is what you need to get, and this is what you got, or this is what you didn't get, then it makes them a part of their learning and gives them control over their own employee development. We need to be servicing them. When we first started and people say, oh, they're not going to want to do that. I said, well, as it turns out, they want to know, like when you ever think about when you go into like a review or something and your manager says, hey, listen, you're great, but you need to improve your communication skills. Well, you're going, what does that look like, right? In this case, we need to be very transparent with what that looks like, and we need to be able to show them how to get to that skill. Some people say that I can make my surveys to be more, did you like it, or will you use it, or whatever. And yes, you can. You can kind of try to make them a little bit more rigorous. There's some people in our industry that have done a good job of trying to help us to do that. But it's still, to our senior leaders, it's all about opinion. Now, sometimes some leaders will go with opinion, say, okay, opinion's enough for me. Many leaders say, can't see where you're actually adding capability to the organization. I can't tell what that is. We've shown you what design analytics are, how they're created, and how they're captured through those mechanisms. Now let me kind of show you what they tell us. So what we're going to do is we've got this benchmark as to what is the benchmark for you having that capability. We can use that before the course to find out whether they actually know it. We can use a post-exam after the course to find out if they learned it. Obviously, we can use a transfer exam to see if they retained it and are using it. And then we can do a metric. This is the model that helps you to see how this works. So we've talked about the phases before. We've got the examining phase. This is where we are looking at what we need to do, right? What do we need to be doing? What are we going to be making? Up until now, we've been talking all in this space. This is where we determine what the metric is, and this is what we determine what the benchmark for success of those skills is, right? This is our pre-exam. That's the benchmark for success, and this is the metric that we're targeting. Then we go into the learning phase where we're actually teaching the course. Then they go into the applying phase where they're retaining it and applying what they learned. And then after that, we can look at the organization and see if any metrics changed after that. Down here, you'll see the metrics. We want to look at the metrics before we do the intervention. We want to look at the skills to see where the skills start beforehand. We want to look at the post skills to see what they learned. We want to look at the skills after they went on the job. These three things are the same assessment. And then after that assessment is done, we look to see whether this metric changed. I'll give you a brief example of one of these, might help you to visualize what this is like. So let's say we did a course. We actually have an employee who was a drug safety company that did a course. They did an onboarding course. They taught drug safety. And drug safety, well, let me ask this first. When I do a pre-assessment, if I had a pre-assessment, say I had 20 people in the class, and I had one person that had 85 on it, and everybody else was at 40. What does that tell me? If I have one person that has a high pre-assessment, that means that one person knows the material. If everybody else was down in the 30s, that means that they don't know the material, right? If the average. If, however, I had an average, all 20 people, or roughly 20 people, ended up with a 75, what does that tell me? That is actually verifying my assessment. If I find out that everybody here roughly knows the material, right then I can know that my assessment here was wrong. They already know this content. So if my assessment that this metric that I need to hit with these behaviors is going to get me there, then that was wrong, right? So when we look at the cost of learning to the organization, the biggest cost is not in us designing the course. The biggest cost is in us running that course. So if I can just take my design analytics and know immediately that the average total that already knew this material, then I've already saved the company money. Because I'm going to go back and I'm going to talk to them and say, okay, this is the metric we got a problem with. Let's look at what other behaviors might be happening, because obviously they know how to do this. Or maybe they know it, but they can't do it over here. So let's talk to the manager and find out why they're not doing it. So if I move forward and then I say, okay, pre-assessment, the manager and the trainer are accountable for coming up with what needs to be taught. So that's pre-assessment. That's why in this accountability matrix, the manager and trainer are held accountable for making sure they're targeting the right things. When I go from the pre-assessment to the post-assessment, if I started, say, an average of 30 here, and I came back to post and I was at, say, 60, the trainer's the most accountable there. Why is that? Because the trainer designs it and facilitates it. Right, exactly. So if it fails between here and here as a class average, right? If an individual fails, that could be a competency issue. But if the class average fails between here and here, right? If this one goes down, then we know it was either the design or the facilitation. So at that stage, the designer can stop and say, all right, we need to stop and fix this course, right? And then we immediately save money because we're not assuming that they come over here. If they didn't learn it, they're certainly not going to transfer it, right? So the trainer's more accountable here. Let's say the post was 95, we hit our goal, we're good. Then we go over to transfer. We're giving the same assessment to the same students. It's sent to them, they complete it. We're testing this time to see whether they retained it and are applying it. If we start from a 90 as a class average here, and then we come over to transfer and it's down at 70 or 65, the manager's the most accountable. Why is that? Follow through, exactly right. There's something in the environment of the job that they know what to do and can do it because you've tested it. You know for sure. At this point, we have verified all of the work and time and money that we spent in learning was worth it. We've verified that we need the course here, and we verified that we gave the skill here. If it fails here, then what we are basically showing there is that there's not enough support on the floor in order for it to be actually applied. And this is where the sticky point comes in, because without design analytics, it's a matter of opinion. They say, oh yeah, I liked it here, and here they didn't do it. They're still going to come back at transfer and say training wasn't any good, right? Because there was no verification of them actually getting the skill. But if there is verification of them getting the skill, then when you come here and it fails at transfer, that's a very different conversation, right? You can say, we can empirically show that they've learned it and they can do it. Here, it's failing, so let's look at why it's failing there. If they didn't learn it, we wouldn't get good transfer scores. Same thing goes if they didn't transfer, if it didn't get applied in the organization, we're not going to get a change in the metric. Because if there are no behaviors changed here, then the metric that measures that behavior change is not going to happen. So let me show you how design analytics manifest and what you can see. I've kind of shown you what you learn if you do a post, a pre, post, and a transfer, right? Obviously, you don't have to do all of those, but different ones tell you different things to help you run your learning business. If you just do a post, you would get a bar, something like this that says, this is what they learned, and this is what they didn't learn. If you do just a post in any kind of your courses, that's only going to tell you where they ended up. It's not going to tell you necessarily that learning course gave them that information, but it is going to tell you where they ended up, right? So you can do just a post if you want to verify that they learned and you want to test the difference between learning and actual application. If you add the pre-score, it basically gives you a blue line, which would say something that this says this is what they knew before they started, this is what they learned in the course, and this is what they did not learn. This helps you to understand, first of all, verifies whether you need that course, right? And it also helps you show specifically what they learned from what you taught them. And then finally, you have the opportunity to add a transfer, same assessment, you're checking again to see where they are. This is the transfer mark. If this was a red, it would say that it moved below what you had expected them to do at application. So you can see how when you take these different ones, you don't have to take them all. Obviously, you learn different things from different ones. But when you take them, it teaches you things about your business, and then you can report on that for running your business. And I'm going to show you what that looks like. So this is just an example of what a report might look like. This is saying that this is an observable behavior, showing the use of the 6 steps. These are critical thinking skills. So these are outcomes. When a learner looks at this, they get this report that says when they did their pre-assessment, they would have gotten just this blue that says these are the things I already know. All this other would have been what I need to know. Then when they did finish their course, they would have gotten this green and this red that said, oh, I got this skill, I got this skill, I got this skill. Looks like they got most of the skills pretty much, right? So they know what they got, which skills they were targeting. These are not the questions. These are the objectives. These are the outcomes they need in their job. And then this is telling them where they sit within at the time of the transfer assessment. If they find they're going down, then they can have that conversation. You as a designer can support them with their manager, or they can go to their manager and say, I need to get more influence or more ability to do these things, right? Either way, you can see how something like this prepares both the designer gets this report, the manager can get this report, the student can get this report to see where people land and the journey of learning and how that journey of learning is being reinforced or solidified. So the things that you're looking for is a high pre-assessment, a low post-assessment, a low transfer assessment, or no change in the metric. If you get a high pre-assessment, that's saying that they already know the material. It would look something like this. If you get a low post-assessment, it means they didn't learn it. They had room to grow, but they didn't grow. You get a low transfer, that means that they learned all this and they lost all this. So every step of the way gives you information about running the business, all the way down to the actual skills that are learned and those that are not learned. When you do an ROI, this is an example of an ROI calculation. This is a capturing of all the costs, right? This is the cost of development, cost of delivery. That's what that is. This is a capture of the metrics, and it talks about the difference in the change in the actual metric. I'm not going to explain how all that's done. It's done through a calculation. It's done through a system. What I do want to show you here is when you run any calculation like this, it's important to connect the learning, what actually came out of the learning and the transfer with the ROI, because otherwise I could put any metric down here and match it to any cost and say that we created a difference. The really key is right here, and I'm going to blow that up for you. So this is what we're looking at right here. This is the actual results. This is the ROI from that course. This was from an actual course where it was a recruiting company. So they teach recruiters how to come in and how to do submittals, and that's why they were using this metric. This is the ROI when students got here. So it ties the actual learning to the ROI result. And this here, the potential gain and potential benefit, that is saying if I took this transfer all the way out here, then this would be my potential gain and my potential benefit. The key here is that it's not a guessing game. It is exactly which metrics we identified, the ones that we targeted, were mapping against the target. If for some reason we showed transfer, like we showed our skills were learned and our skills were applied, that's powerful enough, right? We can show change on the job in these skill areas by this population. That's really powerful. If we go and we find out that that change in the job didn't change the metric, then that's telling us that the metric was either the wrong metric to measure those performance, so we're testing against our knowledge there, or that we measured that metric at the wrong time, because metrics are measured at different times, right? So you might want to measure the metric again. Oftentimes what people are doing is they're measuring a cross-section of metrics, and every time they do a running learning course, they have a handful of ones that they think would impact, and they start learning which ones actually impact. And so then they'd be able to say, when we run this course, this metric is actually changed. So that is showing how the connection between design analytics makes ROI. This is where in the examining phase, we do a pre-assessment. That gives us a scrap metric, and it answers this question. Are we working on the right thing? This is the learn metric. It gives us the competency. It says, are programs effective at creating capability? Transfer assessment gives us the application metric, and it says, is learning sustained or applied on the job? And then finally, we've got the pre-posted metric, which says, does learning impact business unit metrics? So you can see how that designing that way, getting yourself a good instrument of measure can provide you all of that information all the way through. This is just showing you one bar that can say how you did across organizations, so across departments. So if we're measuring a set of learning courses and all these divisions took that learning course, you can see how each division did in the learning, how they did in the application. And this would show me at a glance that, hey, Dallas is rocking it. Not only are they reinforcing it, but they're growing in the learning, which is what we need. But we might want to keep our eye on Charlotte. Charlotte's starting to dip. We might want to talk to that manager and see how we can continue to reinforce. This is the ultimate end. What we're looking for is always to reduce scrap. Our pre-score is going to give us the scrap. Increase competencies. Our courses are going to give us competency by those 3 outcomes, and to ensure application. Those are the things that our department should be doing, right? So those are the things that we need to be monitoring. An image of exactly what this came from a customer a long time ago, but when they first started measuring their courses, they were finding that 55% of what they were teaching in this course or this set of courses was already known. Over the years, they reduced that. They started targeting the things that weren't known and putting those in the courses, which saved them time and money because they were focusing just on what the organization needed. In the early days, they had 55% already known. They had a good program. They brought them up to like 80s here, like up in the 80s. Over the years, they kept the amount of the competency that they gained in the course pretty high. But in the early days, when they started at 55%, brought them to 80, but because it wasn't applied at transfer, this was all lost. So this was the only gain that they saw in learning. Over the years, as they started getting data and started working with the organization, because remember, we're only effective as we work with the rest of the organization, they began to work with them. And somewhere around this point in time, they got to the point where they worked well with the organization. Then they started supporting it and then building upon it. So this is the same slide with just some descriptors on it. This line tells us, are we aligned with the organization's needs? Are we working on the right things? This one tells us, are we doing our jobs well? You know, are our programs effective? And this line says, are you working well with other business units to ensure learning is applied? So all of these things roll up into metrics that our business leaders can provide to on a quarterly basis that says, yes, we're working on the right things. Yes, our courses are effective. And yes, the organization is working with us or not working with us. And what do we need to support them? Thank you for your attention. I hope that you learned something. And most important, I hope that you start to apply some of these concepts in your designing, because we really need to elevate our practice so that we can prove our value.